Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of introducing our speaker this evening, our own Vicken, who's going to speak on post-mint, that is, altered items, and looking forward to this. Vicken?
Okay. Okay, so everything you are going to see today is something that has been damaged or otherwise altered after it has left the mint or otherwise been created. In other words, pretty much everything you're going to see here, if you were going to attempt to send this off for grading, would either have been coming back as ungradable or as a detailed piece. So when you think about that, well, you generally try and avoid detailed pieces, right? Like you're not going to add one of these to your collection, right? Somebody decided to do that to a 1909 SVDB. You're not going to see those, though, tonight. The idea here is the stuff that you're going to see all has a story behind it. It has a reason. Like we didn't just do it just I don't know who did that on the right, but you know, like for example, the Tibetan tankas, these are different types of cuts they would do to make change for them, for example. So those are the types of things that you are going to see tonight and now. You're not going to see, you know, counterfeits, mint errors, those kind of things. These are things that people intentionally altered after leaving the mint. So to start off, we start simple, just cutting the coins. A lot of coins historically, back when they were kind of considered something, you know, back when they were made of silver, when the silver really meant something, were very regularly cut to make change. Aside from the Tibetan coins that you just saw, some of the most common ones include pieces of 8 and even our own large cents. I have been told, I have not independently verified it, but I've been told that back in those days, prices went down to as little as 1/4 of 1 cent. So if you happen to be out there metal detecting and dig up a 1/4 of a cent, that wasn't just done just to be clever. Somebody actually did that as to spend the thing. Of course, one of the most common ones we know very well would be the 8 reals. We call them pieces of 8 for a reason. Much more interesting and perhaps a little bit less known is they weren't always cut into pieces of 8. For example, and these are in the World Coin Book, a lot of Caribbean island nations there. Can you see it here? Does that look like a 1/4 to you? Hopefully not. That was actually cut into 5ths. And not only was that one cut into 5ths, but then it was stamped officially to make it a 3 real coin because, you know, 8 divided by 5 is 3. What's 3 times 5? It's 15. In other words, that's almost twice its value doing that. So for good reason, people didn't really trust those. So naturally, the ones that managed to survive to the modern day are, you know, quite valuable, naturally. People also used to, when it comes to this kind of thing, people used to commonly clip coins around the edge. You see a large hoard of this. This one was discovered just a few years ago in England. They actually called that one the toenail hoard. It is actually really uncommon to find a hoard of this kind of stuff that large. And the reason for that, of course, was because in those days, doing that kind of thing was punishable by death. So for somebody to do that many of them and then hide them in the woods, buried out in the middle of who knows where, that's kind of unusual. So that one there was actually quite amazing just because of the size of the hoard. We also had, kind of along with cuts and clips, English silver pennies were regularly found bent. Those I found were done because it was generally done as like an offering to a saint or something to that effect. I find, unfortunately, that it's very difficult to find those still bent. You can find them unbent. Can you tell how this one has been unbent? You can, you know, If you bend it and unbend it, you see the stress mark running right through it, and you can find a ton of those on eBay. So I went looking for a bent one just to add it to the stuff that I had. Nobody really likes their coins bent. I mean, I'd like one as an example, but they're all kind of like that now. Moving on from cuts, we have holes, and of course there are lots and lots of holes in coins. These ones are some of the official ones. In the case of the Greenland 25 ore, what happened was in 1941 they issued a coin that was extremely similar to it, so they actually temporarily recalled all of those that were in circulation, sent them back to New York to be holed, and then brought them back to Greenland to be used. So this is one of those, you got to be careful about how quickly you judge these kind of things, because that's actually an official thing that they did. If you have, like I have, a couple years ago I was collecting a lot of modern banknotes, and when I would look at the Indian ones, I would commonly find staple holes in them, and I would think, man, this is terrible. But then I looked and read more about them. That kind of thing, stapling them together in bundles, is actually something that has very commonly been done, to the point where a few years ago the Bank of India was telling the local banks, don't do that anymore. I'm sure they still do. But just to give you another idea, if you're out there collecting like more recent Indian banknotes, they're supposed to be there, more or less. Perhaps the most interesting about these officially hold coins would be the holy dollars. These were issued in the Caribbean islands as well, but the ones here are from Australia. So the idea here was, those 8 reals really took a beating. They imported a bunch of those 8 real coins to Australia, and the idea there was before they established mints and official, places that they could make money on a regular basis, they imported some of those to Australia, cut out the centers, and then they stamped them. The middle piece is called a dump, and that's a size of 15 pence, while the larger one with the hole in it was, I think, a 5 shilling coin. And the idea was, by doing that made them really undesirable as far as letting them flee the colony. Those kind of things, as you can imagine, because they were supposed to be temporary to begin with, they were almost all recalled back to India, where they were originally imported from and melted down. There are only a couple of hundred of them left. There are actually stories out there in newspapers from the 1930s where people found those among buckets of washers. That becomes all the more interesting when you learn that just a couple of years ago, the rarest variety of these Australian holy dollars sold at auction for $500,000. So not nothing. There are like 400 or so of those outstanding, I think. Now more to the unofficial holes. Very commonly, people would put holes in things mainly as jewelry pieces. And of course, the jewelry pieces are going to have like a single hole on them, and they're usually the small light coins. They're really common, of course. They're very easy to find. So unless you find something interesting like this one here, it's like, personally, I don't imagine why you would collect them necessarily. This one here, you may or may not be able to read it from the picture here. You can see it on the table after I'm done. This one here is a British silver 3 pence dated 1763. Then somebody put a hole in it, I imagine as a jewelry piece, but then they actually counter-stamped it. It says right here, Bournemouth WPP, August of 1894. Now, I'm not sure what exactly that was for. The most likely suspect as to what it is seemed to have happened many years after that. But I thought that was interesting enough, a 1700s coin counter-stamped 1800s. So I was like, that's a pretty neat one to have. You have, you have your repaired holes. You have your brooches, which are not really holes, but when you pull out the pins on them, They kind of look like some, that's why I kind of put them there. If you see the holes on each end of them, or pairs of holes on each end, it's because they ended up using them as jewelry pieces like this. I actually bought one of these very recently. It didn't come to me yet, but somebody made that during World War II and actually labeled it from, where was it? Maybe it was Alamein, 1942. So the soldiers were making those kind of things too. Every once in a while you find something kind of weird and unusual. This one here was just too strange, and believe me, it looks so much uglier in person than in the picture. This was a really tacky necklace made out of those plastic bar tokens as a jewelry piece. Person says, I bought it from an estate, and from the estate, the person's mom made it. To keep busy, I guess. But anyway, those are the jewelry pieces. Then we get started into the more unusual holes. Large cents in particular saw a great deal of use and abuse. As I'm sure you can imagine, you didn't really have a Sears in the mid-1800s, and the cheapest, easiest way to get a piece of copper was what? Well, a large cent. If you've got a very large hole in the center, that tends to indicate that it's a washer, we hope. I'll back on that in a minute. If you've got a pair of holes in the center, that may be a humdinger. A humdinger was something where what you would do is you would put the holes in the cent, put it on a piece of string, and you would just twirl it to kind of as a noisemaker. If the holes were more spread apart than the one that you see here, there's actually a good chance that it was used as a curtain weight. I've seen pictures of little lead planchets that they used to put as curtain weights. More than that, 3 or 4 holes, people would actually take these and use these as buttons. I'm not sure how much a button costs back in the day, but I'm quite sure that you really couldn't beat 1 cent as the price of a button. Then people really started getting creative with these. If the edges are ridged, there's a really good chance that it was actually used as a gear. Again, gears were not something that were necessarily easy to come across in the 1800s. On the other hand, you might also have a pie crimper. What's the difference between a gear and a pie crimper? You can see here the edges is toothed, whereas with the pie crimper, if you look at it straight on, it's circular, because with the crimper, the edges are supposed to alternate. And yes, there are many, many, many examples of these kinds of things still on the crimpers themselves. I have not yet come across those, but they're very interesting. You see all sorts of them on there, including the early cents, the 1790s, 1800s cents. There are plenty of examples of those being carved up and used as crimpers. In at least one case, this one here, if you look for one of these, if you search online for leather stitcher, you will see a leather stitcher looking in this exact same, proportion, shape, that kind of thing. And in this case here, this is a 2-cent piece that was apparently used as a leather stitcher. The teeth on this are much sharper and much deeper than the others. Now back to this one. I don't know if you'd believe it or not, but I actually think that of all these here, as interesting as these are, the washer is the most interesting one, and here's why. I bought that one a couple months ago, and I thought I'd be lazy and kind of go take a picture on the internet for this, and I actually found that I could not find a satisfactory one to replace the picture of this, so I took the picture of mine again. Take a good look at the details on this. This one here, you can't see them all. There's only so much you're going to see on the presentation. But if you take a look at it, you will find that the edges on this have actually been filed down. The hole is large, it is well centered, and as you can see around it, is actually sloping downwards. If you were to turn this particular piece over, you are going to see that the piece on the reverse has been flattened, and if you run your fingers along it, you will see that it is very slightly bent. In other words, those are the kind of minor little details that you can look at and think to yourself, yeah, this was actually used as a washer. As opposed to, some random, I could come along and drill a hole in a large cent, right? but I'm not going to file down the edges, and even if I did, I'd have to find a way of darkening it and keeping the patina of the same consistency across the coin. You know, those kind of details are the kind of details you can think and look to yourself, yeah, this was probably real. The ones I was looking at on eBay that were hold, they didn't have those kind of details to them, which is why I was not satisfied personally that those ones were being used as washers. Now, speaking of large cents, we have copperheads, both literally and figuratively. You're probably not going to be able to read the text on this one here. This is actually from a book of political cartoons and poetry from 1863. It says here, watch this, "The traitor our common sense mars, and on liberty plainly he wars, taking freedom away from the Union, I say, when he cuts her head from the stars." Now you take a look at that there, well, that's very obviously a large cent and a snake, right? So what happened? Well, this was Civil War. So what happened? There were plenty of sympathizers with the South in the North during the time, not surprisingly, right? So they were labeled as Copperheads, and of course the idea there was to associate them with the snake, the Copperheads. But of course they took that more literally. They decided to adopt that as a symbol of what they were, and what better way to do that was with literally a copperhead. They likely, like this one here, dug up in Virginia. This is likely the way they did it. They carved out the head, they polished it up, and they put a pin back to them. This here, and both of these are available on the internet thanks to the marvels of the modern internet. This is an advertisement from Harper's Weekly where a company called, what was it? Bronenkant, I think it was. What they did here is they actually put an advertisement in Harper's Weekly in 1863, and they claimed that they were the originators of this. So, you know, you take that for what it is worth, and they were actually offering to do this, to sell these copperhead pins to people for 15 cents each, or you could buy them in bulk at 100 for $10. So this was clearly a common thing if they were willing to sell these in bulk. These were very, very, very controversial for their time. There are other newspaper articles out there during the same time where people were actually arrested for wearing these. The people who would wear these would say, you know, they were the ones that were pro-peace, they were the ones that were pro-liberty and freedom of speech. Keep in mind that during the Civil War, we were under martial law for a reason. So, you know, the idea of this representing pro-peace was not necessarily what you'd think it would be, given this context. Moving on, we start looking at surface scratches. So, anytime you scratch the surface of a coin intentionally, it's called graffiti. There are obviously all sorts of graffitis. Some people here really do a number ruining coins. This here being a couple $1,000s. This particular one here, somebody scratched an X down here, and if you saw the reverse, a single X on it as well. This here was like a $3,000 coin, and the person who's trying to sell this wants around $2,000 for it, to give you an idea of how undesirable this is. Sometimes people would do this kind of scratchings to indicate names, like this one here. This is obviously not somebody who we're going to learn who it was anymore, but somebody decided to make a memory to mom, probably being born in 1799 and then of course died in 1840. You notice that this is a silver dollar, and the silver dollar is from 1842. It has wear on it, so there's really, after seeing some of the examples on their sites, kind of get an idea of why. Love tokens have been put on everything from 2-cent pieces, 3-cent nickels, 3-cent silvers. There are at least a couple of double eagle love tokens. Imagine what that meant back when they were being circulated. And in at least one case, somebody thought it was a good idea to do that to a Bryan dollar, even. just to get an idea of what people were using for love tokens. But that wasn't it. People did all sorts of things with these. Some of them, they put loops on them. They put special, this one here would really glitter if you were to flip it around a little bit. Some of them were enameled, like the British one here. This particular design seems to be particularly common enamel-wise. People would embellish them. It was the first time that they premiered, and of course they were a souvenir from then. As I'm sure you can imagine, those ones are a little bit more valuable than the ones where you put 50 cents and crank them through today. You got to be careful with these, as I found out. I cannot imagine why you do this personally, but someone actually did a restrike of these. But as you can tell, by the way, like the 1893 is very even as opposed to the way it kind of bows outwards. You can tell looking at them, the original compared to the restrike. Those kind of things were very commonly put on, Indian cents, of course, but some people put them on 2-cent coins and other ones. In this one here, at the New York's World Fair in 1939, somebody decided that they would permanently destroy a Feuchtwanger cent. I guess those were a little bit cheaper back in those days. Of course, the irony of it is that that particular piece there sold maybe a decade ago through Heritage for probably a good 2-3 times what it would have been if it would have been undamaged. So that's kind of the unusual irony of it. That doesn't mean that you should destroy your Feuchtwanger cents these days, mind you. But just to give you an idea of the kind of things that are out there. I have found and collected a few. People put these on everything. I found one where somebody said that it was put on a steel cent, but it had a hole in the center. Do steel cents have holes in the centers? No. I took a good look at it, and it was a French coin from 1918. And it was done with, American flag, liberty, patriotism kind of design on it. This one here, done for the bicentennial, look at it. It's another one of those things that you can never avoid, those little bus tokens. I'm not sure how they got those through the machine. I guess it was more maybe not the cranking machine, but something else that let you kind of put those through. Most of these, of course, are souvenir tokens, but in some cases they would use them for advertising. This nice, clever person who didn't put his name on this one, but put a phone number on it, advertised his own elongated coin services by putting that on a Lincoln cent. And one thing that I found very interesting when you can find them is there are at least a few cases where people made elongated cents as trade tokens. This one here was for a lawnmower shop, and this was just a Lincoln cent, but when pressed, this one here is good for $1 in trade. A metal detecting company, I know a metal detecting company made one of these that was good for $10 in trade. There are quite a few people that take this kind of stuff seriously. They call themselves the Elongated Collectors, or TEC, and like the other societies, they have their own website. Some people take these very, very seriously to the point where they do this. There is one person out there where what he is doing, he is actually selling titanium blanks. So either you can get the titanium blank and press your own, or in a couple cases he pressed his and are offering those for sale as well. Why, oh why would you do that? Well, you can see it right there. Titanium is a metal that anodizes very well, and because of that you can make some nice colored tokens because of that. So it goes even beyond taking coins. They just make the actual blanks to continue this.
That's a stretch.
Okay. Repousses. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because I'm told that somebody has already talked about these kind of recently. But there are at least a few interesting things here. I promise you there's at least a couple things you're going to see on the next slide that I guarantee you haven't seen before. So what these were is, repoussé is a French word meaning pop out. The very first of these was patented in 1903 by William Mallier from Hackensack, New Jersey. And the idea, you will see this on the next slide, was what he did originally. The first person who did this was he actually cut the face of Liberty out of here and soldered in the 3D design on there, thus creating a very nice little badge. The next person who came along, he actually filed for the patent the same year, but got it 1904, George Kepler. He actually made dies where what you would do is you'd actually stamp the coin out so it would be one full coin, and that there is one of the dies that you would use to make these. Many, many, many modern versions of these exist. Some of them are very fancy, very interesting, as you'll see in a moment. The older ones actually have patent bars on these. Like that one there says patented August 11th, 1803. Those ones, of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, are the more valuable ones. This here, thanks to, again, the marvels of the modern internet, Google Patents, you can actually see the original patent designs for these. Might be a little bit hard to see because of the size, but you can always take a look later if you want. You can see here what ended up happening was you can actually see how you cut the face out of it and attach them together. If you've looked for or otherwise seen these, you will have seen the one of these on a pin, the ones joined together for jewelry. This is the actual patent for it. Mallier filed 5 patents for it. In one of them, he actually called Liberty the goddess of liberty. In other cases, they actually had a man's face on them, but he wouldn't name the man, so take that for what it is. This one here, you see how the design ends up being stamped through, so the coin stays in one piece in that sense. To give you an idea of the kind of things available, here are some of them. Personally, I feel like looking at these, this is probably the single most frustrating thing you will see today to collect. And the reason for that is this. Obviously, these were machine-made. They're not like some of the things you're about to see that were all handmade and thus unique. These you would think people made multiples of. So, of course, in some cases, the Kennedy on the Kennedy half, very common. Lincoln on a Lincoln cent, okay, that one's pretty common too. The bicentennial motif, okay, that one's common too. But then take a look at some of the other ones. This one here is of a stag on a Morgan dollar. You can actually see just a little bit the bits of a pin poking out on the other side. Where do you get one of those? I cannot imagine. I also cannot imagine anywhere other than seeing this on the Newman portal where you can find Mr. J.P. Morgan on the Morgan dollar. I'm also not necessarily sure. The next one over, it's the Goddess of Liberty again, but now it's on a British halfpenny. So that's a kind of an interesting combination. This one here, that's the Kaiser on a dry mark. This one here, I was able to get one of these on eBay. Another pair of those actually ended yesterday. I did not win those. That one there is Queen Elizabeth on a South African halfpenny. That one there was actually silvered, in case you're wondering about the color. But again, okay, so that one, a pair of those just ended yesterday. But generally speaking, there are so many of these machine-made things that I feel like are really difficult to get a hold of for whatever reason. But moving on, trench art. So trench art is the type of things that soldiers would make while in the trenches. You imagine that those were kind of popular, of course, World War I, where you kind of introduced trench warfare, but they were done as early as the Napoleonic Wars. When it comes to trench art and coins, well, coins and spent bullets, as I'm sure you can imagine, were by far and away the easiest ways that a soldier in a war was able to get a hold of pieces of metal and otherwise do things with them. They would do all sorts of interesting, unusual things. They could make, charms. They could make, like I said, I have like a bracelet, which I didn't get yet, from World War II. These kind of charms would be souvenirs of where they would be. This one, Baghdad, 1917. This one was Belgium, World War I. This one here, it actually says on the front, Alamein, 1942. This is an ashtray made from a large bullet and a coin embedded in the center of it. This one here, I would have loved to get one of these, but then the seller says to me, Due to regulations, I can't send this by airmail anymore. This one here from World War II was a working lighter during its time, and its front and back were actually made with Palestinian coins. They would use other coins as well, of course, but I thought the Palestinian ones were the most interesting. The most readily available examples of this, as I'm sure you can imagine, were from World War I, World War II, and the Boer War. Now this one here, this is something I'm kind of trying to research if I'm able to. This motif here, this idea with Mr. Kruger is extremely common, and from what little I could gather on the internet, it seems like it was meant to be a political message. As I'm sure you can imagine, when good old Uncle Paul here was kind of seen as the face of the rebellion against the British Empire, he was of course portrayed by the British as, you know, the devil incarnate. And I think the idea here, not 100% sure, but I think the idea here was to make him look and portrayed like this kind of greasy, backward, idiotic hillbilly type person. I have seen examples of these South African coins where what they did was on the reverse of these particular coins, they actually had like the shield with South Africa on it. Some people who seem to have a lot of time on their hands actually carved out the shield and embedded a British 3 pence into it. That doesn't seem to be like an act of honor. That seems to be like an act of, you know, an act of intentional disrespect, as I'm sure you can imagine. All sorts of very interesting things kind of came out of these. This one here is a rifle that came out of Australia. It's hard to see, but they actually have many carvings here referring to the Boer War, and there are a couple of coins with Paul Kruger on them. This one here is, you know, a soldier's hat. May be hard to see due to the tilt, but that's actually a British penny on the top. This one here is supposed to be a combination of a whistle and a spoon. A lot of coins have been fashioned into spoons, many modern, many older like that. As with so many people, there are people out there who collect nothing but trench art. One person who I came across who seems to be really good at this kind of stuff, her name is Judy Wall. She is from England. She runs this site. She collects more than just the metal-based trench arts, mind you. She'll collect things like diaries, drawings, paper kind of things. She's published a book on it. If you go and take a look at her things, I found her things are absolutely amazing compared to nearly anything that's out there on eBay at the moment. Not that the kind of stuff you saw was bad by any means. I thought a lot of the things we've seen are interesting, but she has, you know, this one here is religious imagery, tobacco paraphernalia. This one is supposed to be the cover of a matchbox. This one here is a sculpture of a violin. The coin is on the end. This one here is a little container just to keep your dice in, British penny on it, British penny on the end of a whistle. She has a lot of absolutely amazing things. Some soldiers came up with some really, really elaborate things here. Kettle Pennys. You may or may not have seen some of these. I don't know how popular or well known or common they are, but these were little kettles fashioned out of pennies. You can see them. This is how they turned out, of course, and you can see usually on the bottom they'll say, you know, 1 cent. These were made from prisoners in the 20s and 30s. We actually have confirmation of that due to at least one very prolific collector of these, the Penny Lady. We actually have literature to the effect that just flat out states that these came from prisons and prisoners. Sometimes they were made by soldiers or other people like that, but mainly prisoners. According to the literature that we do have, they say that these were made by only a handful of prisoners, and they were only given out as souvenirs, as, you know, like thank yous for contributions and donations. How much of that I believe, I'm not necessarily sure. Remember, we're talking about prisoners in the 30s. So I'll leave that up to you to decide how much you believe that, but there's a fair number of literatures to that extent. This one here is from Connecticut from 1924. Other ones that I didn't picture are from, like Chicago in the 30s, that kind of thing. But of course, they didn't just make kettles, they made all sorts of implements. You could collect your own little tea sets of these kind of things. Some of them include things like working padlocks. This one here is a baseball. You can see it says 1 cent there. You can see if you look. And in a couple of very rare, interesting cases, this particular kettle was made with a barber dime. Another one was actually made with a Liberty nickel. It seems like those kind of things exist, but they're quite rare, especially compared to the Kettle Pennys. Moving on, surface alterations. Now this in and of itself is a whole topic by itself, and there's only so many of these I'm going to show off. The vast majority of surface alterations today are modern creations. You know, you have some very nice, very pretty, I like these personally. You know, as long as you don't damage something that's too rare, I suppose. But if you take the time, you can make some very nice souvenir jewelry type pieces. If you're wondering, I don't know how many of you are familiar or been around a lot of jewelry type things, but a lot of our modern silver dollars were holograms. A lot of the silver dollars here would be gold plated. If you see one of these with a nice black surface to it, that's almost certainly ruthenium coloring. They use that a lot in jewelry to give jewelry a nice black metallic look to it. They could also use rhodium for the same purpose, but if you think about the price differential between ruthenium and rhodium, it's something like $100 versus at least $3,000 at the moment. I imagine the ruthenium is much more common. The most significant, by far, historical example of this kind of thing, I think, would be the racketeer nickel. The one where they took the Liberty nickel, plated it with gold, and then passed it off as a $5 gold piece. There are lots and lots of rumors about surrounding this kind of thing. There are a lot of modern ones where people create modern, well-worn nickels, just plate them with gold. Other people will do this for jewelry, and it can often be really difficult to tell whether or not a racketeer nickel is genuine, except in this one case here. A couple of years ago, when people in Deadwood, South Dakota were doing renovations, like archaeological digging, they actually unearthed that one there. So that one there, we are 100% sure of at least that one there being a real racketeer nickel. Beyond that, common, easily available things would be the copper cents, so to speak. Obviously, there's steel cents that have been plated with copper in honor of the real copper cents. You're not finding these in your lunch money anymore, of course. Well, those would be the main altered surfaces, other than, of course, shipwreck coins. You know, when it comes to environmental damage, you try and send in something that's been dug out of the ground, they'll just grade it details, you know, environmental damage, corrosion, that kind of thing. The biggest exception to this would be coins that have been recovered from shipwrecks, because of this, of course, turns them into historical items. It seems to me, just looking out there, the ones that were recovered from the El Cazador wreck, which was sunk in 1784 and recovered in the 1990s, seem to be the most common, most easily available. There are many, many, many of these. Many of these are actually detailed in the front of your red books, including, what was it, the SS Central America, they said was actually the largest ever lost, and thus the largest ever found. So many coins ranging from copper to silver to, yes, gold doubloons have been recovered from these kind of things. In at least, but most of them will just call them genuine and then just call them a shipwreck effect. I know that NGC, if you were to actually grade it, they actually have classes of ABC, because as I'm sure you can imagine, the amount of wear and corrosion by the salt water varies dramatically. This one here, you know, this gold coin was graded MS61. A lot of silver coins can look obliterated. Others will look almost brand new. So that thus the different designations. And so many of these are easily available out there. In the case of the doubloons, somebody out there wants 30 or 40,000 for them. I mean, I wish they were cheaper personally. In at least one case, I thought this was very interesting. There is such a thing as shipwreck currency. This ship here, a Dutch ship called the SS Breda, was sunk in 1940 because of World War II reasons. And it was carrying sheets of paper that had been watermarked with, they were intended to be turned into Indian rupees, 5s and 10s. They were recovered decades later. They were preserved well enough that many examples of this can actually be had. So that's your probably only example of shipwreck currency out there. Those are the main things when it comes to environmental damages. This one item, which I showed off in January, I thought was kind of neat. Just bring it up again. You can ask more about it if you want. But this particular one apparently was part of a fire, and thus, if you've ever seen a blackened surface like that, those kind of coins were probably in a fire. Somebody probably recovered this from the Spokane fire, mentioned as such as a memento, ended up maybe circulating a little bit. Somebody put it up for sale, ended up getting this, just to get an idea of that particular one. But obviously, that's not something you will find every day. Couple of currencies, as I'm sure you can imagine, currencies being paper money. There's only so much you can do with it after it's been made. It's not like you can carve it into a lighter or something. The main things when it comes to currencies are alterations done during World War II. What ended up happening, of course, is soldiers would take their notes, they would bring them to bars, and they would autograph each other's notes. Whoever didn't have them would get to pay for the bar that night. There are many instances of these kind of things where famous people would sign them, like Bob Hope, Jack Benny, those kind of people. Many famous people would have short snorters too. I think President Roosevelt had his own. In some cases, what would happen when the signatures got too full, they would actually tape them together and create, well, I guess long snorters, and they would have rows and rows and rows of these kind of things. Unfortunately, due to age, you know, the bills survive just fine, but as you can see, the tape doesn't. The tape is now, what, like 80 years old? And so many of these have fallen apart. That's what you see. If you see a World War II era note with very old tape on it, that is an unfortunate example of one of those really nice long rolls of these that has fallen apart due to age. Sometimes soldiers would take notes and send them home as souvenirs. This particular one is a little bit bloodier than most. That particular one says it was taken off of a dead Jap on the Marshall Islands, and it has little stains on it of what I'm sure are blood. Another thing that they used in World War II was this one here. This is the Philippines peso note, and what they actually did here was pilots were actually given these here artificially aged. This was stained with coffee to make it look darker, well used, and the idea there for that kind of thing was to kind of avoid arousing suspicion. If they were downed, if they were captured, that kind of thing. Postage stamp currency. I'm not sure why somebody would be allowed to get away with this. I guess it was an official government thing. There are a very small number of these out there, but people are finding more of them as they see that they exist. There are a few cases here where people took the Civil War fractional currencies known as postage stamp currencies and literally decided to use them as postage stamps. There are approximately 10 or so of these known at the moment, but I think that people are discovering more of these as they go through more philatelic type of items. You know, that's a place where you're more likely to find these. Almost all of them look like so, you know, they're from the period or not that long after, but there's one very interesting, very unique one. I kind of wish I had won this one personally when it went up to auction back in April. but my last master's class actually cost about as much as this note did, and that was actually kind of more important, I have to admit. In this case here, this was sent from a man in New Jersey to his son-in-law in Ireland in 1939, a little bit before the war officially started. On top of the fact that it has regular stamps on it and Irish stamps on it and 2 postage notes instead of 1, even with all that there, that's not even the most amazing thing about it. The most amazing thing, ironically enough, is actually the ink stamp here. Hard to read, but this was actually verified, and it says it on that ink stamp. This used to be part of President Roosevelt's stamp collection. That's why I thought it would have been interesting to own, but that's also the reason why it sold for more than $2,000 a few months ago. That's the main part of it. A couple of modern creations to give you an idea. You know, people do all sorts of things with coins. In some cases, they will take both old silver dollars and newer bullion ones, turn them into puzzle pieces. I think that's pretty neat. Those kind of expensive because you can imagine the effort and work takes quite a bit to make something like that. People will do all sorts of things, cutting out the designs on those. You know, you see plenty of simple ones out there. That particular Morgan dollar there, hopefully it wasn't a rare one, but doing that to every single letter, as I'm sure you can imagine, took quite a bit of effort. Guitar picks, people swear that they sound different than plastic ones. I'm not a musician, so I couldn't attest to that, but people do that to make them as guitar picks. If you see hollowed out coins, those are probably magician's coins. You will also see rings out there. The rings are actually made in 2 different ways. One is when you tap the edges to make them like so, and then drill into the center. Tapping the edges to kind of flatten the coin out like that is called spooning, which is something I found out only recently. The other way, see that one there? What they actually did for that kind of ring, which I think looks kind of nicer personally, is they drilled the hole first, forced it down one of those ring measurers, and that actually kind of forced the design to flip. You can kind of tell because you see the original rim is only on one side and still intact, whereas the rim on this one would have been flattened out and smushed up like that. A couple of miscellaneous items to wrap up. This one here is something that seems to be relatively common enough, like you see them out there. That was probably quack medicine. It seems that they did that there because this kind of thing kind of conducted, the silver-zinc combination conducted electricity, and you know electricity was supposed to be good for you. It was probably related to quack medicine like the Boyd's battery, if you happen to know what that is. These ones here, the cowboy spurs, I like that one personally because it seems that unlike things like the pie crimpers, the numismatic community at large doesn't really know about those too well, so it was reasonably easy to find one of those. The rolls on them, those are actually century-old German coins in this particular case. Why German coins? I don't know, but that's how they decided to do it. This one here I thought was very interesting. It's 2 sens that actually swivel out and you see a design on them. That design, for those of you who can't look up kanji, that actually says Yoko. Yoko is a name, you know, like Yoko Ono. It's supposed to be a female name. Personally, I look at that, see that it's a female name, see that it's a fan. I like to think maybe that belonged to a geisha. I don't think I will ever have a way of knowing that for sure, of course. If you see this here, this is a British new pence. It's been stamped with 1 shilling. You may or may not know, maybe you can guess, if you were to look at the reverse of that, that one's dated 1970 because that was the year that they switched over to their new decimal-based system. And this person here put 1 shilling on it because 1 shilling was what has now become 5 new pence. I have not seen any others like this out there, considering that this was a nationwide thing. I mean, I imagine it's relatively common. In this case here, you've all seen in case cents, of course. In this case here, I'm not sure why they would do this, but I guess it was a political message. They took Indian cents, cut them in half, and they said, you know, half a cent per acre is keeping Milwaukee in repair. So I guess that was supposed to be done as a political message. So some closing remarks. You think about of the type of things you saw. If you think about the concrete versus abstract, most of the things that you saw there, if you look at the more modern ones, they tend to be souvenirs, charms, mementos, those kind of things, as compared to the older ones that were gears, lighters, that sort of thing. I think that happened was because back in those days, money was a more concrete idea. You know, like half an ounce of copper versus 1 ounce of copper means something. Nowadays, well, I guess it kind of does, but not as much. You know, you think about the way our silver was taken out of our coinage to get an idea of that kind of thing. Whenever you're looking at these kind of things, if you look for them, for the vast majority of them, you do need a certain amount of faith for them because, you know, again, I can do things like go drill holes in some of them, but as I pointed out with that piece there, you can look at details like that. You can get an idea of how real something is by kind of thinking, would it look like this if it was used the way it's being advertised as? But, you know, again, there's always a certain amount of faith that's required for those kind of things. Some of the things that help with that, with the authenticity, is if the price of the coin is quite a bit less than the undamaged coin, you know, then you don't really have a motivation to destroy a coin to make something like this. A lot of the pieces, as I'm sure you noticed, were unique because they're handmade. Others were machine-made. Now, as maybe you can guess at this point here, this was kind of the point of this all. The idea here is when I was looking at some of these, found a few of these here, I thought to myself, well, details pieces, these are damaged pieces. These are things that people normally avoid. But hopefully you can kind of see, just looking through this set of them that I made, the idea here is, my point in making this was, anybody who has a decent amount of creativity, an eye for good pieces, patience to look around and collect these things, can make a good collection out of really anything. And that was the idea that inspired me to make this to begin with. And that's the presentation. Anybody has any questions? Okay.